When you do a literature review, you're painting a picture of what is known about your topic. Imagine that each source that you find is like a different color on your paint palette. Each one adds detail, depth, and texture to your painting. Now, some sources may be bright and bold colors, like big landmark studies that everyone in the field talks about, even if they were published decades ago and are still being cited. Now, other sources may be the more subtle background colors. These are your smaller, more emerging studies that may have been published within the last 10 years. And these sources fill in the details and add more texture to the overall context of what you're trying to see. Together, they help you showcase a whole painting of your topic that you're discussing. But sometimes when you take a step back, you can see that there's a blank spot on the canvas. That blank spot is what we call a gap in the literature. And instead of worrying when you find one, you should see it as your chance to stand out. In this short video, we'll learn what a literature review is and how to handle those gaps in the literature. So let's dive in. A literature review is exactly what it sounds like. A review of current literature, like your journal articles, publications from trade journals, books, statistics, videos, or any other relevant discussions about a certain topic. Now, a good literature review lays the foundation for your research paper so that the reader can understand the importance of your topic and the relevance of your argument. But literature reviews are not a space for you just to provide a summary of each article you find by saying Smith 2020 said this and Johnson found blah, blah, blah. Instead, literature reviews are a space to bring together all the sources you find into a conversation with one another to spotlight how they compare, contrast, and connect ideas. But you can't do a literature review without sources. So let's say you're doing a research project and your topic is what mental health challenges do female college athletes face compared to their male counterparts? And you decide to settle on the following search terms, such as mental health, anxiety, stress, female athletes or women athletes, male athletes or college athletes. And you decide to use scholarly databases that are available through the University Library website to find relevant sources to your topic. So as you can see, we have over 700 databases, but just for a first look at this topic, we're going to go with Academic Search Complete, also known as EBSCO, because it's a good broad database for any beginning research project to see what's out there. And so in the search bar, we'll type in some of the keywords we identified earlier of female athletes and mental health. And when we search, we see that we have 225 sources available. Now, that is a lot to go through. So one way we can limit our searches is by going to the left-hand side and clicking peer reviewed to make sure that we're only looking at sources that are peer reviewed, which is getting us down, but we're still over that 200 number. And so another thing we can do to limit our searches even more is to filter by date to make sure that we are looking at sources within the last 10 years. And so now we are at 165 sources, still a lot, but we're at least under that 200 mark. And so it's giving us a little bit more refined searching to make sure it's within the last 10 years. And these are all now peer reviewed sources. And as you can see, there are a lot of articles that we can look at that could be very relevant to our research topic. But for the purposes of this article that we're looking at today, we should probably load back up to the top and start one of the earlier ones. And so when you go to the landing page of an article, there's a lot to look at here. You can see that we have subject terms, which are another way to say a keyword. So as we're researching, we may want to swap out one of the keywords that we're using for the subject terms that are identified in the articles that we're finding. We also can see that there is an abstract here for us to briefly skim to get a general idea of what this topic is about before we read the whole article. But you might be wondering, where do you actually go to read the article? So if you go to the left-hand side, you can see PDF full text as an option. And when you click on that, it will pull up the article for you to read at your leisure. You also have the ability to download or print the article if it's something that you want to keep long-term or just review later. But let's also say that you find an article you like, but you don't see that PDF button, you may see this red Find It button instead. And so you can click on that, and in the section where it says links to content, there should be a link that will take you to the article. But if you don't see that, there's also a button down here for IU Indianapolis Interlibrary Loan Services. And if you click on that link, it will help you get the article within about 72 hours. Another cool thing you can see on this landing page is that we have a cite button on the far right-hand side. So whether you're citing an APA or MLA or Chicago, you'll be able to find a citation that is generated by the website. But always be sure to double check these citations to make sure that they're correct. Now, you may also want to pull the URL, but instead of pulling it from the top of the web page, instead go back to the right-hand side and click on permalink and click on the URL link there. This is a permanent link that is not going to change in comparison to the link of the actual web browser. So be sure to pull that link instead. So keep that long-term as you begin your research project. Because it's important as you do your literature review to keep track of the sources that you find and take notes on the patterns or key findings that you notice so you can bring them up in your literature review. Because again, the goal is not just to summarize what you find, but to compare, contrast, and connect them together. A good way to keep track of the sources you find is through a synthesis grid. And you can find a link to a sample grid for your research that you can use in the video description. Basically, a synthesis grid is a tool to help you organize and compare sources as you are working on your literature review. So the sample table has 4 columns for you to work in, one for source, one for you to put the key argument or claim made by that source, to put down what the source role is relevant to your topic, whether it's providing, for example, background information, it's in direct support of your argument, or it may even be providing a counter argument to what you're discussing, and a column for you to provide the relevance to your argument. So how does this connect to your thesis or argument, or how do you plan to use this within your literature review? So again, a synthesis grid is a cool tool just to help you organize what you're finding in your literature review. But as you are going through your literature review, you may find that a certain area hasn't been studied enough or hasn't been studied in a way that you need for your argument. This is called a gap in the literature that we alluded to earlier with the painting analogy. Now, there are a variety of reasons why there could be gaps in the literature, and here are some to keep in mind as you start your researching. A common gap could be that there are a lot of outdated research, right? So there could be a lot of older studies that don't reflect current changes. There also could be a missing target population or not the right setting for the research study. So that could cause limited data on what you're looking for. There could be methodology shortcomings, such as researchers looking at it from only a qualitative or only a quantitative point of view. And there also could be missing perspectives, as researchers may not have taken the angle that you're interested in for your actual research paper. So let's visualize what this will look like within our sample research project. So some potential gaps we could see with outdated research, for example, is that we could find a lot of articles that focus on athlete mental health from the early 2000s instead of post-COVID. We also could find that a lot of research is focusing on D1 athletes at largest universities instead of female athletes at smaller universities or even community colleges, which could be a gap. Again, thinking about missing populations. There could be a methodology gap where a lot of studies could only be using surveys or statistical data instead of pulling information from qualitative interviews, hearing directly from the players' mouths. There also could be missing perspectives, like only a few studies that compare male and female athletes' mental health. That is important to keep in mind as well. So as you're doing your research, now that you have a little bit of a framework of potential gaps that you could encounter, how do you actually go about addressing them in your paper? Again, there's a variety of approaches you can take to this, but for this video, we're going to go over 2 options that you can keep in your back pocket to use as you're writing your literature reviews. Option A is all about opportunity. It is essentially you taking the mindset that no one has done this yet, so I will. You would use this approach when you identify a topic that has been either under-researched or overlooked or ignored. In this instance, when you're writing your literature review, you acknowledge the gap and why it exists, and then you would explain how your work fills this gap. And on the screen are a few sample sentence stems to get you started as you write a section of your literature review with this framing in mind. So an example in relation to this example project we've been discussing, we can say, while much research has focused on female athletes from Division I universities, little attention has been given to those female athletes who go to smaller D3 and D4 universities as it pertains to their mental health. That is a way for us to acknowledge why a gap exists and for us to fill in the gap with our own research and say, this is why our research is needed to fill in this gap to provide more context to the conversation about athletes' mental health. Now, that's just opportunity A. You may come across something that doesn't really fit a framework of seeing it as an opportunity. So that's where option B comes into play of limitation. This is when you have a situation where a gap cannot be fully solved. This happens if there is a challenge or barrier that exists that you or other researchers may not be able to resolve to gather more information due to things like ethical or logistical challenges, biases, or other barriers that could be encountered. And again, here are some sentence stems that you can use to get you started as you write this section to again acknowledge it and to turn it into a proactive portion of your literature review. And so within the context of our example, we could say something along the lines of number 4 of the lack of diverse perspectives in existing literature may reflect systemic bias in how female athletes' health is considered mentally, right? If we want to take the framework that there is more male perspectives in research studies than there are female athletes, right? So acknowledging that bias is important to lay the groundwork for how your paper is going to fill in those gaps. So remember, there's a lot of different ways you can approach discussing a gap in the literature for this section of your paper. These are just 2 pathways that I am suggesting to guide your writing and to utilize to strengthen your research argument as well. So remember, gaps aren't roadblocks. They're opportunities to showcase your critical thinking skills. So don't panic, acknowledge the gap, explain its importance, and position your work as part of the larger conversation. Finding a research gap is your time to shine in your paper. So don't panic, just start writing.